Good morning. Our daf today is Kuf Yud Gimel. We are starting with the new Mishnah on Kuf Yud Gimel, and we're going to get to some very nice agadot today. So you're going to enjoy this. So don't leave. Okay. The Mishnah says as follows: Koshrin deli bepiskiya avalo b'chevel. So this is saying that if you want to tie the barrel that not the the bucket that goes into the well, so you need a rope to tie the bucket to lower it into the well. So it says you can use a belt avalo b'chevel, but you can't use a rope. What's the reason? So apparently the reason is because you're not going to leave your belt attached to the bucket, but you will leave a rope attached to the bucket, and then you'll be making a permanent knot, and a permanent knot is a problem. Rabbi Yehuda allows you to tie it even with a rope. We're going to see why this is a little further on, or at least that would seem to be what he says. Kalal Amar Rabbi Yehuda, there's a general principle that Rabbi Yehuda articulated, Kol kesher she'eno shel kiyama en chayavin alav, that any knot which is lacking permanence, which is not a permanent knot, is not a knot that is biblically forbidden to make on Shabbat. Okay, now we saw that concept before. We're going to see it developed further here. The Gemara says, Chevel demai. We see in our Mishnah that there's an argument between the rabbis and Rabbi Yehuda as to tying a bucket with a rope. Okay, so the question is, what kind of rope are we speaking of? So, kesher shel kiyamahu. So, I'm sorry, ilema hevel da'alma Rabbi Yehuda matir kesher shel kiyamahu. So, if we're talking about a regular rope, that is impossible, because how could Rabbi Yehuda tell us that you're allowed to tie a bucket with a rope? Tying a bucket with a rope is certainly tying a permanent knot. Ela hevel de gardi. What it means is the rope of a weaver's rope. So, why are you allowed to tie it to a bucket? According to Rabbi Yehuda, apparently because it is it's something that you're going to take off later. You're not going to, the weaver who uses his rope to tie a bucket, to lower a bucket into the well, is not going to leave his rope there permanently. He's going to remove it and take it back at some point. So therefore Rabbi Yehuda is lenient and says that it's no problem to use that rope. Whereas the rabbis say that they're concerned that if you use such a rope to tie the bucket, you may confuse that with a normal rope. You may go ahead and tie a normal rope to the bucket as well. So now the Gemara says, so the implication here is that according to the rabbis, there's a possibility that if we allow a person to use one kind of rope on Shabbat to tie their bucket, they may use another type of rope, which would actually be a biblical violation. They might use a rope that they'll permanently leave on the bucket. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, we are not concerned for this issue. We therefore allow the person to use a weaver's rope. In other words, they're not allowed to use a regular rope. Everybody agrees with that. But a weaver's rope is the issue. And Rabbi Yehuda is not concerned that you're going to confuse a weaver's rope, which would only be put there temporarily, with a regular rope, which might be put there permanently. Or and we raise the following objection. Chevel deli shenifsak. Let's say the rope attached to the bucket at the well breaks. So what do? Lo yekoshro. Now obviously you cannot tie it normally, because that would be making a permanent knot in a permanent rope, and that's asur, that is prohibited on Shabbat. Ela onvo, what you do is you make a bow. You're allowed to make a bow because a bow is considered an unstable knot. It's not permanent. It will last you for that Shabbat, and then you'll take it out and you'll replace the rope afterwards. But you're not allowed to make a permanent knot. For Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yehuda says, Korech alav punda u'piskiya u'bilvad shelo ya'anvenu. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, what you have to do is bring some other kind of item, such as a belt of some sort, and tie the two ends of the rope. So the rope broke. So now you have two ends of the rope. So what are you going to do? You have to take a belt or something and wrap it around in order to hold the two ends together, but you can't bow tie the two together. The rabbi said just take the two ends that are broken and make a bow knot out of them, so it's not a permanent knot. Rabbi Yehuda says no, you have to tie something else around them. So of course this is problematic, because in our Mishnah Rabbi Yehuda is being more lenient. He's saying, you don't have to worry, use a weaver's rope. I know it's called a rope, but you're not going to confuse that with a regular rope. And here he's saying, don't make a slip knot, because maybe you're going to make a real knot. So is he concerned about making precautions or not? It seems like a contradiction. So kashed Rabbanan. So it seems like kashed Rabbi Yehuda, kashed Rabbanan. There seems to be a contradiction both between the statements of Rabbi Yehuda and the statements of the rabbis, because in our Mishnah the rabbis are more stringent about making safeguards when it comes to tying knots, and here they're more lenient. Here they're saying just bow tie the two together. In other words, make a slip knot or whatever of the two sides of the rope, and that's fine. Rabbi Yehuda is saying no. In the Mishnah, the rabbis are saying, don't use a weaver's rope because you might come to use a regular rope, and Rabbi Yehuda is saying it's fine. So they switch sides in terms of who's more lenient and who is more cautious. It's no problem, we can resolve the problem because chevel b'chevel michalaf, aniva b'kshira lo michalfa. Because the rabbis will tell you there's a very simple difference here. In our Mishnah, what are we talking about? Using a rope to tie the bucket. Now you're saying that because it's a weaver's rope, I'll see that it's clearly a different type of rope. Well, I'm not so convinced. Maybe somebody will say, what's the difference? One type of rope, another type of rope. But in this Baraita, what are they saying? They're saying that you can tie it with a slip knot. You can just make a bow, not a full knot. Nobody's going to confuse making a bow with tying a real knot. They'll realize the reason that they're tying a slip knot is because it's Shabbat, and they won't come to tie a permanent knot. But with ropes, what's the difference? One rope, another rope. They're not going to see the difference. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda says that we don't need to make a gezerah. People won't confuse ropes. But when it comes to tying a bow tie, so what's the answer? So he says, Rabbi Yehuda la kasha hatam la mishum de mechalfa aniva b'kshira ela aniva gufa kshirahi. What is the answer? That it's not that really Rabbi Yehuda is consistent. But Rabbi Yehuda says when it comes to confusing things, I'm not concerned. I'm not going to tell you don't use a rope that's only a temporary type of fix because you might use a permanent rope. I'm not going to tell you that. But aniva, tying a slip knot, according to Rabbi Yehuda, is itself tying. That itself is problematic. You're not allowed to do it. That's why he doesn't allow you to do it. Not because you might confuse tying a slip knot with tying a real knot, but because he says tying a slip knot is itself not allowed. And therefore, he prohibits it. Okay, that's the way that we learn it. So basically, when it comes to confusing things, Rabbi Yehuda is more lenient. He says we are not concerned about confusing one rope with another. But any kind of tying, even of a slip knot, according to him, is a problem. The rabbis say we're not concerned about tying a slip knot because you're not going to confuse it with a regular knot, but we are concerned about using a rope, even a temporary rope, because you might come to use a permanent rope and make a permanent knot. Now, the Gemara goes on. Amar Rabbi Abba said, Amar Rav Chia bar Ashi Amar Rav, that Rav Chia bar Ashi said, the Rav said, Mevi Adam Chayv, let me talk about Parao. You're allowed to take a rope from inside your house and you tie one end of it to the cow and one end of it to the trough to make sure that the cow eats what it's supposed to eat, right? And doesn't wander off. You're allowed to do that. Now, ostensibly, the reason is because these are temporary knots. You're not going to leave the cow tethered to its trough forever. It's only a temporary measure. So, there is an objection to that. Rabbi Acha Aricha. So Rabbi Acha Aricha, Dehu Rabbi Acha Bar Papa. So the tall Rabbi Acha, who is also known, whose real name was Rabbi Acha Bar Papa, said to Rabbi Abba, Chevel shebe'evus koshero b'para v'sheba para koshero be'evus u'bilvad shelo yavi chevel mitoch beto v'yikshor b'para u'be'evus. In fact, we learned in a Braita exactly the opposite. That you can, if the rope is already tied to the cow, you can tie it to the trough. If the rope is already tied to the trough, you can tie it to the cow. But you can't bring a rope from your house and tie it to both. We explicitly learned that. So how can you tell me that you can bring a rope from your house and tie it to both? So the answer is Hatam Chayvel Da'alma Hacha Chayvel De Gardi. Again, it depends. If you're talking about a real rope, in other words, there always has to be something that makes clear that this is a temporary arrangement. So if you're talking about a real rope, there's a limitation. With a real rope, unless it has to either be already tied to the cow or already tied to the trough. So that way we know that when you're attaching it to the other end, when you're tying the cow to the trough or you're tying the trough to the cow, that you're later going to undo the knot and you're going to let the cow go. But when you're using chevel de gardi, when you're using a rope which in and of itself is a temporary rope, because it's a weaver's rope, the weaver is going to be like, hey, give me my rope back, I only let you use that for 5 minutes, you can't keep it forever. So there, we're more lenient, and we say that since we know it's a temporary arrangement to begin with, and you're using a rope that's only temporarily assigned to this task, you can tie both ends.
To the non-permanent rope.
A non-permanent tying is like tying your shoes. Oh, a rope that's not permanent, like if you used your belt to tie something, or if you used, let's say,
those round suitcases that we take down.
Oh yeah, something like that. Yeah. So there are a lot of things that we use that are temporary fasteners as opposed to permanent. Sure. Now they're usually made out of plastic or something, but yeah. Okay, so now we say as follows, and after this Mishnah is when we're going to get into the Agadah. So sit tight and be ready for that. You're going to enjoy that. So now we say as follows. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said, Kelei kiva'eh. You're allowed to move the weaver's implements on Shabbat. What are the weaver's implements? It's talking about the parts of the loom on Shabbat. If you wanted to use them, let's say you want to take one of the big wheels that the garments are placed on, one of the big rods, and you want to sit on it, or you want to put your pot on it, or something like that. You're allowed to. That's what he says. So now, afilu koved elyon v'koved tachton. You can even take. Oh wait, I skipped a part. Yeah, that's the next part. Right. Ba'umine Rav Yehuda, they asked Rav Yehuda, koved elyon v'koved tachton ma'u in v'lav v'rafya b'yedei. So they asked Rav Yehuda, what about the large pieces? In other words, there's a large piece of the loom that holds the garment up. It's called koved ha'elyon and koved ha'tachton, because if you have to think about the way that they would have it was they would have one end of the fabric attached to one side of the loom and one end at the other. And as they wove the garment, so they would move it, they would roll it down and keep moving along as they were weaving. So it was attached to two, like a Torah scroll or something. It was attached to two things that would turn. Except this is on the top of the wheels that would turn. The wheels would turn and move the fabric down. So it's talking about these very large pieces upon which the clothing would be, or the fabric in process would be placed. Can you move that? So in v'lav rafya b'yedei, that means that he went back and forth on it. It was weak in his hands, meaning he didn't know the answer. However, Itmar, it was stated, Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Shmuel, Rav Nachman said that Shmuel said, that there was actually an explicit statement of Rav Nachman in the name of Shmuel that even those large pieces that the fabric rests on when you weave, you're allowed to move them on Shabbat. Avalo et ha'amudim, but not the pillars. What are the pillars? This is a different type of loom. There were professional looms that were horizontal, and then there were home looms that the ladies would use that were vertical. So they took up less space in the house, I guess, because they were vertical instead of being huge, huge pieces of machinery that stretched out. They went up and down. So they would be planted by amudim in the ground. There were pillars on the sides of them, and they would be physically implanted in the ground to remain stationary. So you can't remove those. You can't move those amudim. You can't take them out and use those for some other purpose on Shabbat. But any other part of the loom, apparently you can. Okay, Amar le Rava Rav Nachman. Rava said to Rav Nachman, Ma'ishina amudim dila. What's the reason why you can't move the amudim, these pillars in the ground? If you're going to tell me because you're making holes in the ground, you're not doing that on purpose. You put those pillars into holes in the ground, and pulling them out isn't making the holes, they're already there. Right? Because they're already put in the ground. It's not like you're putting it in the ground to begin with, you're just taking it out. It's not, as we learned in another Mishnah that we've seen before, if you plant turnips or radishes underneath a vine, okay, so what he says is that let's say you have radishes or turnips and you want to preserve them. You're not planting them, you want to preserve them. So they would preserve them under the ground. Now let's say you go into your vineyard. You're not allowed to plant other vegetables in a vineyard. It's kilayim bakerem. You're not allowed to. Let's say the person he wants to store his turnips. He's not actually going to plant them there. He wants to store them underground. Okay, so the problem is where do we draw the line between planting and storage, right? So it says if the alin, right, because of three things. First of all, because of kilayim, because you're mixing them together, you're mixing diverse plants in a vineyard, you're not allowed to do that. Number two is because of shemitah. Let's say shemitah, is that considered planting on shemitah if you're just storing your radishes underground? Number three, ma'aser. If you already took ma'aser from these vegetables, and then you replant it, and it grows more. Now you have more maaser you have to give. It's a new thing. So we don't consider it planting. Why? It's not a problem for maaser. You're not going to have to retithe it. It's not shemitah. It's not for kilayim. Why not? Because since miktzat alav migulin, since the leaves are sticking out of the ground, it's clear that you didn't want to fully plant it in. You were just putting it there to preserve it. Okay, so he says similarly here. And v'nitalin b'Shabbat. You can even pull it out on Shabbat. Why? Because the hole was already made before Shabbat.
Would you say it's a way of refrigerating?
It's sort of, yeah. Yeah, in a way, yeah, for sure, because during the summer, it was the coolest place. Yeah, so to pull that out on Shabbat is okay, because the hole is already made in the ground. You're not making the hole. So too here, those amudim of the loom that are stuck into the ground, when you pull them out, you're not making the holes. The holes were already there. And incidentally, what's the issue with moving the pieces of the loom on Shabbat? Why is it even an issue? Because of muktzeh, obviously, because normally it's used for activities like weaving that are not allowed on Shabbat. And Rashi says also because since the loom is a very expensive piece of equipment, normally a weaver wouldn't want you to use it for any other purpose. So we have a concept of muktzeh mechamat chisaron kis, which means if something is very expensive, and normally, like let's say you have an iPad or you have like some fancy computer thing, and someone says, "Oh, can I use that as a tray for my tea on Shabbat?" No, because you would never let somebody use it for anything else because it's going to be damaged. So even though it could function as a tray, you're not going to let him use it for that. So anything expensive. So Rashi comes and says that you might think the same about the loom. The loom is something that's expensive. You don't want it to be ruined. And the chidush here is that it's not considered a thing which can't be used for anything else because it's too expensive. Now the Mefarshim say, well, what about the fact that it's kli shemelach, also shemelachto le'isur? It's used for prohibited activity. That should also be a concern. Apparently they're saying that isn't a concern either. Okay, so now the question is, so again, the issue is not pulling the amudim out of the ground. That's not the issue. And that's why you're allowed to pull, let's say if you stored vegetables that are protruding from the ground, but they're in a hole in the ground, you're allowed to pull them out on Shabbat. Why are you not allowed to pull these amudim out of the loom out of the ground? Because it's in the house. In the house, we're not worried about the holes. The holes, they were already made before. We're worried that you're going to smooth out the holes because it's your house. You don't want holes in the floor. So when you pull these spikes out of the ground, you might, end up covering up the holes and actually making the ground flatter in your house, fixing your floor, essentially. And we don't want that to happen. That's why we don't allow you to do it. In the field, we're not worried. You're not going to want to flatten out the ground in the field. The field is the field. If it has a hole in it, it has a hole in it. You're not going to flatten it out. Ba'amine Rabbi Yochanan Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yochanan asked Rabbi Yehuda Bar Liva'eh. When we're dealing with weaving implements such as the large wheel of the loom and the lower, in other words, the large bars or the large poles on which the fabric was placed when you would be weaving. So, what is the status of touching those on Shabbat? Ma'ulet taltalan b'Shabbat. Amar lei en metaltalin. Ma ta'am? He says you can't move them. And what's the reason you can't move them? Because they're not nitalin, meaning they're so heavy that they're not normally moved even during the weekday. So Rashi says, Af b'chol mipnei kovdan hilkach kol melachtan lekach. Because there's something so heavy that you would never move them even during the weekday, we consider them designated only for weaving, and therefore not permitted to be moved or handled on Shabbat. And that is the final halacha, that if you have a loom, you cannot move the parts of the loom on Shabbat because it is considered muktzeh.
I understand why you have to move. It's two huge rolls.
Right.
To move them, to sit on them?
Maybe to sit on them or something,
How do you sit on them? It's chutim.
No, it's not being used. In other words, it's just, when it's not used, it's empty, of course, right? So it doesn't have fabric on it. It's just sitting there. So yeah, you might think, oh, we're having guests, we need a stool.
They didn't have a chair from Costco.
Yeah, they didn't come to Magen David and borrow the chairs here either. Yeah. Okay, the Mishnah says mekapelin takelim afilu arba'a v'chamisha pa'amim. You're allowed to fold clothing on Shabbat. We're going to see some caveats to this in a moment. Even 4 or 5 times, meaning if you need to fold it because you're going to use it on Shabbat, you're allowed to fold it. But only if you're going to use it on Shabbat. You can even make your bed. But I'm sure that, don't tell your wife about this, Mishnah. You're allowed to make your bed, but only if you're going to go back to sleep on it on Shabbat. That's only from nighttime of Shabbat to daytime. Avalo mi Shabbat lemotzei Shabbat. You can't make your bed on Shabbat for motzei Shabbat because that's preparing. Rabbi Shmuel says, "Mikaplin et hakelim matinat mitot miyom kippurim leShabbat." Now, in those days, remember, Yom Kippur could fall on a Friday or a Sunday. Nowadays, the calendar is fixed; it can never fall on a Friday and it can never fall on a Sunday. There's never 2 days Shabbat Yom Kippur. It used to be that it could fall out on Friday and it could fall out on Sunday until they fixed the calendar, centuries later. So, in the times of the Mishnah, that was something that could happen regularly. So, yeah, later in the later generation. So Rabbi Ishmael says you can make your bed if Yom Kippur falls out on Friday. You can make your bed on Friday for Shabbat. You're allowed to prepare from Yom Kippur to Shabbat according to Rabbi Ishmael. And moreover, he says, "V'chelvei Shabbat kerevin b'Yom Kippurim." And if Yom Kippur falls on Sunday, and there are fats left over from the Shabbat korbanot, you can continue to burn them even on Yom Kippur, because Yom Kippur is assigned a lesser status. Avalo shel Yom Kippurim b'Shabbat, but you cannot burn the fats of Yom Kippur korbanot into Shabbat. If Yom Kippur falls on Friday, you can't continue to burn the korbanot into Shabbat. It only goes the other way. So basically Shabbat is primary. So you can prepare from Yom Kippur to Shabbat. You can burn korbanot from Shabbat on Yom Kippur because you're violating, so to speak, Yom Kippur for the sake of Shabbat. That you're allowed to do, even though it's not a violation, but so to speak. But you're not allowed to make Shabbat subordinate to Yom Kippur. You're not allowed to make your bed on Shabbat for Yom Kippur. You're not allowed to burn the korbanot of Shabbat on Yom Kippur. And then along comes Rabbi Akiva Omer, Lo shel Shabbat kerevin b'Yom Kippurim v'lo shel Yom Kippurim kerevin b'Shabbat. No. According to Rabbi Akiva, no. You cannot do it either way. The Shabbat korbanot cannot be burned on Yom Kippur. The Yom Kippur ones cannot be burned on Shabbat. Each one is independent. It's not like when you go from Yom Tov to Shabbat, that Yom Tov is lesser than Shabbat, and things can be done actually on Yom Tov if you have Eruv Tavshilin to support, to benefit, to prepare for Shabbat, and not vice versa. Right? According to Rabbi Akiva, that's what Rabbi Ishmael is comparing it to Yom Tov. It's similar to Yom Tov according to Rabbi Ishmael. According to Rabbi Akiva, no, it's similar to 2 different categories of Shabbat. They're equal, basically. So one cannot prepare for the other or serve the other. And the Tosafot here mentions the issue of folding talitot on Shabbat. If they're going to be for the purpose of the next day, that can be a problem. He mentions Mikan lamadnu dasur lekapel talitot shel bet knesset lefi shem tzorach machan. Okay, so that's where the issue comes from. Now the Gemara says, Amrei Dvei Rabbi Yanai, the Yeshiva of Rabbi Yanai said, Lo shanu ela ba'adam echad, that we only learned this about one person. In other words, you can fold your own clothing. Aval b'shnei b'nei adam, lo. But when 2 people fold something, it's much more effective. Have you ever seen 2 people, fold like a tablecloth? It's much better. So that type of folding you can't do on Shabbat. It's too much of an improvement in the garment to do that. And similarly, when it comes to folding, we only said this about new clothing, because with new clothing, it's still, the creases are very distinct, and you're not really adding that much by folding it. But older clothing that's already worn out, when you fold that, you're really making a difference in strengthening the creases, so it would be a problem. And even with new clothing, that's only white clothing. But not colored clothing. So basically, what are we saying so far? You can only fold by yourself white old clothing. That's all you can fold. White new clothing, rather. Sorry, right. White new clothing. Sorry. And we also only said that if ein lo lachlif, you don't have anything else to wear. Aval yesh lo lachlif lo. But if you have other ones that you can wear and you don't need to fold these on Shabbat, then no. So basically, what are the conditions? It's the only clothing you have. It's new. And it's white, and you're doing it by yourself. But if you have other clothing, or it's colored, or it's older, or then you wouldn't be allowed to do it. And you certainly can't do it with 2 people. You have to be doing it alone. So Tana Shel Beit Rabban Gamliel, the house of Rabban Gamliel, which of course they were very wealthy, so there's no surprise that they had more than one shirt. Lo hayu mekapelin kelei lavan shelen mipnei shehaya lehen lachlif, that they never folded their clothing on Shabbat because they always had something else to wear and they didn't need to fold it. Amar Rafuna says, Im yesh lo lachlif yachlif. If he has something else to wear, he should change for Shabbat. This doesn't really relate to the issue of folding. This is going back to something we learned earlier in the Masekhet about changing your clothes for Shabbat. He says, if you have clothing to change into for Shabbat, you should. Then a person should lower their clothing. What that means is that they used to have very large togas, you could kind of think of it as, and they would pin them up during the week so they could work, because it would hang down. Only the wealthy people went with the flowing things that you see the Romans, sometimes you see the pictures of the Romans with those long flowing robes, they would only wear the wealthy people, but the poor people, they had to pin it up so their arms were free to work. That's like ketonet pasim, that one of the interpretations of ketonet pasim that Yaakov gave to Yosef is that it was something that went to pas, it went down to his hand, pas hayad. In other words, it covered his hand because he didn't have to work. He was a supervisor.
That would explain why the brothers
didn't like that.
Were jealous of him.
Yeah.
They were out working, and he was.
He was not right. Not only was he was supervising, which is a fancy word for not doing any work, but he had right. But his consultant. That's right. Yeah. So he wore clothing he wore clothing that went all the way down to his hands. That's pasaya. That's one interpretation. Anyway, so that's what it's saying. So he says, if you don't have any other garment, they're poor. You don't have any other garment. So just release the pinning of the clothing so that you look like royalty on Shabbat. So one day you look like royalty. So then the Gemara says, Matkifla Rav Safra raised an objection to this. But doesn't that seem arrogant to wear flowing, robes? I mean, who do you think you are? You think you're a big shot? So kevan dechol yoma la ka'aved v'ha'idana hu deka'aved lo mitchazek ramut rucha. That since he normally doesn't wear his clothing like this, it's only on Shabbat, so it doesn't look like arrogance. It looks like he's trying to honor Shabbat. It looks like the opposite. I'm not arrogant. I'm only doing this on Shabbat to give kavod to the Shabbat. And now we get into a little bit of the halachot of kivod Shabbat, honoring Shabbat. So we say v'chibadto me'asot derechecha. This is a famous pasuk from Yeshayahu. You should honor Shabbat. Im tashimi Shabbat raglecha asur chavazecha v'yom kodeshi. If you restrain your foot because of Shabbat from doing your activities on my holy day, right? And it says v'chibadto me'asot derechecha. And you honor it from pursuing your ways or doing your ways. And what does that mean? That your clothing on Shabbat shouldn't be like your clothing during the weekday. That's what means. Honor it me'asot, from not doing what you normally do. So don't wear the clothing you normally wear. Like Rabbi Yochanan used to say, he used to call his clothing the things that honor me. Because the clothes make the man, like we say in like we say in English. They're saying the clothes make the man, and there's definitely many clothing businesses really market that idea of the image that the clothing creates. It's you feel different, yeah. Just like a uniform. When somebody's in the military, they wear a uniform. It makes them feel, like a soldier. Clothes affect you. From doing your ways. So v'chibadto, we learned wearing nice clothing. Refrain from doing your ways. Don't let your walking on Shabbat be like you're walking on the weekday. That's why it says derachecha, your way. Pursuing your desires. What does that mean? Chafetzecha asurin. That's like the song, right? Well, the Chafetzecha asurim vegam lachashov cheshmonot. Which one is that? Yeah.
I know.
Yeah, it's one of the Shabbat songs. So it's one of the Ashkenazi ones. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah, one of the Ashkenazi ones. Yeah. Chafetzecha asurin. Your business is prohibited. Chefte shamayim mutarin. But the desires of heaven are allowed. So Rashi says, Kigon poskim tzedakah, you're allowed to be posek tzedakah, means you're allowed to allocate funds. In other words, that's why we're allowed to do like mechirot of aliyot on Shabbat. We're allowed to make appeals on Shabbat because it's cheftei shamayim. So he says, poskim tzedakah, umishadchim ala tinokot. You can talk to people about shiduchim, le'ares, in order to get them married. So, and this is actually a machloket between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. Beit Shammai doesn't allow it, but we hold like Beit Hillel. So, cheftei shamayim mutarin. V'daber davar. What does daber davar mean? That you shouldn't talk or talk about things. Your talk on Shabbat shouldn't be like your talk on the weekday. Dibur asur, but daber davar means that speaking is prohibited here. Hur mutar, but thinking is not prohibited. There's no thought police in halacha, so there's no way to regulate that. That's not That's not prohibited. So Rashi explains, what does it mean your talk on Shabbat shouldn't be like your weekday talk? He says it means talking about business. You shouldn't talk about business, but you can think about your business. You're worried about your business and you're thinking, oh, what am I going to need to do? That's okay, but don't talk about it. Tosafot adds to this, and actually the Rambam also says in the Mishneh Torah that it goes beyond just talking about business, but any kind of idle chatter, excessive chatter is not kavod for Shabbat. Shabbat should be a time where you use your opportunity to talk about holy things, about meaningful things, and substantive things. And the Tosafot quotes a Yerushalmi about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, that he had his mother was elderly, and one time she was talking up a storm at the Shabbat table, and he said, "Mother, it's Shabbat," and all of a sudden she was quiet. She realized, you're right, we shouldn't be having excessive schmoozing on Shabbat. So it should be a time where you're really using your talk for good things. We understand all of these distinctions between Shabbat and weekday. However, in other words, we understand the speech and the clothing and all that. But what does it mean you're walking on Shabbat? Shouldn't be like you're walking during the week. What does that mean? You have to walk differently? Swing your arms? That's what I mean. So, Mahi, Ki Hada Amar Rav Huna. It's like Rav Huna says, Amar Rav, in the name of Rav. And some say, Amar Rabbi Abba, Amar Rav Huna, that Rabbi Abba said that Rav Huna said, Hayam me'alech b'Shabbat, if a person's walking along on Shabbat, upaga be'ab matamayim, and he walks up to a pool of water. He encounters a pool of water, I should say, Im yachol ad yachet raglo rishona, kodem shete'aker sheni'a mutar, v'im lav asur. If you can step over the puddle without jumping, in other words, you can lift your one leg, reach it over the puddle, and then lift your other leg. In other words, it's narrow enough that you can step over it. You don't have to jump over it, then you can. But if you have to jump over it, you're not allowed to. So Matkifla Rava raised an objection to this. What is he supposed to do? Lekef, he has to go all around the pool. Kamapish behilucha. He's going to be walking too long. In other words, what are you suggesting that he do when he runs into this pool that's too wide? He can't jump over it. So what's he supposed to do? Walk around it? If he walks around it, it's going to be taking him even more time to walk, and that's causing him stress on Shabbat. If you're going to tell me le'avar, he should walk through it without jumping. Zimnin demitvasan maneh maya vatele de sachita. You're going to have a different problem. His clothing is going to get soaked, and then he's going to end up squeezing out his clothing on Shabbat, which is another prohibition on Shabbat. So what are you suggesting he do? He says, Ela beha kevan de live shar shapir dame. Rather, in that case, since there's no alternative, you can jump over the puddle. That's not what it means that you can't, that your walking on Shabbat has to be different, that you're not allowed to jump over puddles. Jump over a puddle if you have to. Rather, it's Rabbi Yossi. It's like what Rabbi asked, what Rabbi Yehuda Nasi asked from Rabbi Ishmael Rabbi Yossi. Can you take large steps? Are you allowed to take a large step on Shabbat? And the answer, and he said on Shabbat. Well, that's what the final halacha is, but this is when they were asking the question. So he asked him, are you allowed to take a large step on Shabbat? And he said to him, Amar Le, he said to him, V'chi bachol mi hutra? Are you allowed to take large steps even on the weekday? She'ani omer, I say, taking large steps reduces 1/500th of the light of the eyes of a person. In other words, it diminishes your energy. Walking too fast, walking with big steps, it's unhealthy, he's saying. It's going to weaken you. You got to take it easy a little bit in life. That's what he says. So, and he says, and when you drink the wine on Friday night, it restores the light of your eyes back. In other words, the Meiri explains this metaphorically. He says it means that a person who overstresses themselves during the week, on Shabbat, he comes and has the Kiddush, he has Shabbat ahead of him, he regains some of that. But the point is, don't overexert yourself. Why are you taking big steps? Even on the weekday, you shouldn't be doing that. So that's what it means. Bachol means that if you're a person who's harried all the time and you're running around on Shabbat, take it easy. Because it's not good for you even during the week to be doing that. So certainly on Shabbat, you shouldn't be taking huge steps, running around. Walk in a leisurely way, show that it's a special day. Again, Rabbi asked Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi another question where the answer was health related. Are you allowed to eat dirt on Shabbat? Now normally when we say eat dirt to somebody, it's like telling them to get out of our face and it's an insult. But this eating of dirt is somehow healthy. They considered it, that it had some medicinal properties or some benefits. So Rashi is saying, he was asking him, is it allowed or is it prohibited under taking medicine? Because you're not allowed to take medicine. Amar le, he said to him, who allowed you to eat dirt during the weekday? Actually, that's a disorder in the DSM, in the manual for psychological and psychiatric disorders. It's called pica. Eating inedible items like dirt, paint, and things like that. It's called pica. It's a real illness. So is that mihutra? Is it allowed? Shani Omer, I say, you're not even allowed to eat dirt during the weekday. Why? Most people would think you wouldn't have to be told that, but right? Because it causes you suffering, right? Injury. It's unhealthy. Amar Rabbi Ami says, Kol ha'ochel me'afra shel Bavel. Anybody who eats from the afra shel Bavel, from the dirt of Bavel, ke'ilu ochel mi'bisar avotav. It's like you're eating the flesh of your ancestors. Why? Because many people were buried there. The Metei Mabul, at the time of the flood, at the end of the flood, all of the dead bodies from the flood all went to Bavel. They all went to Babylonia, and they became part of the sediment, in the ground. So, when you eat the dirt there, you're eating them. So, it's like you're eating shekatim or masim. It's like you're eating creepy, crawly, bugs and vermin. Dichtiv, as it says in the pasuk, vayimach et kol hayikum, because it says that everything was erased from the world during the Mabul. Amar Reish Lakish says, Lama nikra shema Shinar. Why is Bavel called Shinar? Why is Babylonia called Shinar? Shekol Metei Mabul nin'aru lesham. Because all of the Metei Mabul, everyone who died from Noach's flood, was shaken out there. Meaning that's where they ended up. So it's called Shinar, from Lina'er, means to shake something up. Like Hitna'ari in Lechadodi, to move. So Amar Rabbi Yochanan says, Lama nikra shema Mitzula. Why is Bavel called Mitzula, the deep? Shekol Metei Mabul nitztalelu lesham, because all of the dead of the Mabul sunk there. V'yesh omrim, and some say kilu ochel shekatzim or masim. V'ahav vadai itmachu ye itmachu. Why are you telling me that eating the dirt of Bavel is like eating vermin and eating bugs? Everything that was killed during the Mabul certainly has by now melted and it's gone, right? It's dissolved. So why would that be an issue? Amrei, they said kevan de malke gazrube rabanan. That since the rabbis knew that it was unhealthy for you to eat dirt, so they made a gezerah based on a halachic reason and said we're going to consider eating dirt as if you ate the bugs and as if you ate the crawling creatures. But really they did it for medical reasons. They just gave a halachic reason. They said we're going to treat it as if you're eating something that's non-kosher, because they wanted to prevent people from, because a lot of times people won't eat something that's non-kosher, but they eat something that's not healthy. It's definitely true. That's called Jewish life. That's called every kiddush. That's called every Shabbat, right? So they'll eat kosher food, but they won't eat. They won't eat non-kosher, but they'll eat unhealthy. So in order to stop them from eating the dirt, they said that it was halachically that there was a kashrut problem with the dirt. It doesn't have an OU on it. It doesn't have the right certification. So therefore they they stopped the people from eating it. Deha, because hahu gavra, there was a person dachal gargishta. He ate some dirt. V'achal tachale, and then he ate cress, which is a plant. And what happened was this cress ended up molding together, connecting with the dirt and sprouting up and killing him. So the plant started growing inside his body because he had dirt and he had plant. The combination of dirt and plant, it actually grew in there and ended up killing him. So they didn't want anybody else to eat any dirt. So now we say, now we have some midrashim on Megillat Ruth. Okay, Megillat Ruth, very nice. So v'rachatz vasacht. So what does she tell? This is Naomi telling Ruth how to go. Remember, she goes at night to Boaz and she tries to ask him to marry her. So she says to her, "Rachatz vasacht, take a shower, v'rachatz vasacht, v'samt tzimlotaich, and then put on a dress." So Amar Rabbi Elazar, Elu begadim shel Shabbat, because the obvious question is, isn't she wearing something? She doesn't walk around in her birthday suit all the time. She's wearing something. So what does it mean, put on a dress? It means put on a fine dress. Take a shower and anoint yourself with oil and put on your Shabbat clothes. These are big day Shabbat. Ten lechacham. What? Yeah. Ten lechacham v'yachkam od. It says in Mishlei, give to a wise person and he'll become wiser. In other words, you can give good advice to somebody, and if they're really smart, they'll add a of their own wisdom to your advice. They'll take it even further. We have two examples of that. Amar Rabbi Elazar, Zo Ruta Moaviyah Shmuel Haramati. Ruta Moaviyah and Shmuel Haramati are the two examples of people who did this. De'ilu Naomi ka'amrala verachatzt vasacht v'samt simlotayich alayich v'yiradet agoren. Because Naomi said to her, wash yourself and anoint yourself and put on your dress and go down to the threshing floor and meet Boaz at night. But what did she actually do? It says in reality that she went down vatered agoren v'hadar v'tas kechol asher tzivata chamota. And only after she went to the threshing floor did she change into the fancy clothes. What was the reason? So Rashi explains, because if she got all dressed up and in a fancy dress and went out in the middle of the night, what does it look like? Everyone's going to say, oh, it looks like she's going to meet somebody for some liaison. She's a prostitute, or she's going somewhere she shouldn't be going. So therefore she went in a normal clothes, and she changed when she was down there, so nobody would see her changing into these fancy clothes and think something unbecoming about her. Shmuel, and now what's the case of Shmuel, where he showed that he took good advice and made it even better? De'ilu Eli ka'amarle, because the story about Shmuel was that he kept hearing a voice at night, and he kept waking up and running to Eli. Shmuel was young. Shmuel wasn't a prophet yet, and Eli was the old man who was training him. He was the Kohen Gadol at the time. And so Shmuel would be going to sleep in this chamber next to the Beit HaMikdash at the time, and he would hear Shmuel, and he would wake up, and he thought Eli was calling him, and he ran and said, what can I do for you? Oh, no, I didn't call you. Two, 3 times this happens. Finally, Eli says, it's not me, it's Hashem is calling you. It's God is calling you. So next time he speaks to you, you need to say to him, speak, Hashem, because your servant is listening. Don't get up and come run to me. Talk to God. So that's what he tells him to do. So he says, so what wisdom did he have here? Because Eli told him, he said to him, go lie down. So he says, shechav, go lie down. And then, ve'aya imikra elecha, ve'amarta daber Hashem ki shomea avdecha. And go lie down, and if Hashem speaks to you, if you hear the voice again, say, speak Hashem, your servant is listening. But when it comes to Shmuel himself, what did he actually do? He actually, Ma ketiv be, vayavo Hashem vayityasev, vayikra kefa'am befa'am Shmuel. So Hashem came and said again, Shmuel, vayomer Shmuel, daber ki shomea avdecha, velo amar daber Hashem. So very interesting. Eli told them, say, speak Hashem, your servant is listening. But Shmuel himself, what did he do? He just said, speak, your servant is listening, because he still wasn't sure. So he was being careful. Yeah, Eli told him it was Hashem calling him, but he wasn't 100% sure. So instead he said, speak. He didn't want to use Hashem's name in vain if it was incorrect. So back to Ruth. It says that Ruth came and she went and she came and she started collecting in the field. Amar Rabbi Elazar said, Shahalecha uvat, halecha uvat ad shemitza'a bnei adam mehuganim. Why does it say she went and she came? Because she kept trying. She wanted to pick. She was going into Boaz's field and collecting the sheaves that were left for the poor people, because she was living in poverty with Naomi. So what did she do? She kept trying. She only wanted to hang around people who were classy people. She didn't want to hang around the low-life people. So she kept hanging out with different groups until she found a group that was appropriate. That's why it says she kept walking around. Lelech imahem. I'm sorry. Until she found a good group to go with them. Vayomer Boaz lena'aro. Boaz said to his servant, Hanitzav ala kotzerim, who was in charge of all of the harvesters, Lemia na'ara azot. Who is this girl? V'chi darko shel Boaz lishol bana'ara. Was Boaz, who was known as a tzaddik and one of the leaders of his generation, what he asked about every good-looking girl who came in? I mean, what's going on here? Is this appropriate for him to be asking? Amar Rabbi Elazar said, Devar chokhma ra'aba. He saw that she was very smart. That's why it wasn't that he noticed a pretty girl, it was that he noticed that she was doing things that other people were not as educated as she was. That shenei shibolin lakta. Shilosha shibolin enalakta. He saw that when she saw 2 shibolim, you're only allowed to take 2 sheaves that fall. If 3 sheaves fall, you're not allowed to take them. He saw that she knew what the halacha was. When she saw 2 sheaves, she took it. When she saw 3, she didn't take it. So what did that mean? That meant that she really knew the halacha. What?
And she followed it.
Right. So b'matnitatana in another source at Tosefta it says devar tziniut rabba. He saw tziniut. It wasn't just her wisdom. He saw her modesty. How so? So omidot me'umad nofelot miushav. That the grain that she could take, like let's say pe'ah for example. Pe'ah is a corner of the field that's left. So it's standing in the field. So you stand to pick it. Things that fell on the ground that they dropped as they were harvesting. So those things you have to pick up from the ground. So when she was picking up the standing grain, she would be standing. What would be the most natural thing to do to pick up the grain that's on the floor? To bend over and pick it up, but that's not very modest. So she would sit on the ground and collect it from a sitting position rather than attract attention to herself, and that showed great modesty. Boaz says to her, stick around my girls. Stick around the girls that are with me and collect with them. What is it trying to say? Boaz hung out with the girls? He says, spend time with, stick with my girls. What does he mean? Amar Rabbi Elazar said, since it said about Ruth that she stuck to her mother-in-law, Orpah kissed her mother-in-law and left. Ruth decided to stick with Naomi, and the word is dovka. She stuck to her. Right? She stuck to her. So he said, Amar sharei le'idbuke ba. He said, it's allowed to stick with her. In other words, what was the issue? Since she came from Moabite lineage, okay, so there was people who didn't want to accept her because the Moabim were, first of all, enemies of Israel, but also the Torah says that you're not supposed to marry a Moabi. So people were suspicious of her. So when he saw her great commitment to her mother-in-law, what a righteous person, what a pious person was, he says, this one can stick with our girls. That's what he means. He means just like the Jewish girls are marriageable, she's marriageable. Okay? That's why he said that. So then it tells us about how they had lunch when they took a break. Vayomer la Boaz la'eta ochel goshi alom. He said to her, come here. Right? Come and eat with us. Eat with my people. So not only did he let her collect with the poor people, he let her eat with his workers. So Amar Rabbi Elazar says, Remez Ramazla. He showed her a hint. That in the future, the kingdom of David is going to come from you. Dichtiv, as it says. Dichtiv be halom, because the word halom is associated with David HaMelech. Shene'emar vayavo HaMelech David vayeshev levnei Hashem. This is talking about when his kingdom was finally established and secure. He came in and he sat in the house of Hashem at the time. Vayomer, and he said, Mi anochi Hashem Elohim. Who am I, Hashem God? Umi beti, and what is my house? Ki haviotani ad halom. That you have brought me to this point. And halom means to this point. So when he says to her, come to this point, when he summons Ruth, he is making a reference to the statement of David, halom, which meant you brought me to this point, that you made me a nothing, you made me a king. He's saying to her, goshi halom, approach here, meaning you are going to be the ancestor of David HaMelech. V'tavalt pitech b'chometz, dip your bread into the vinegar. Amar Rabbi Elazar said, mikan she'chometz yafeh l'sharav. You see from here that when it's hot outside, you should eat vinegar, because that's what they would serve. They served vinegar to the workers who were outside. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani, Amar Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani, says, Remez Ramazla atid ben latet mimech shemasav kashin kachometz. That there was a remez here, that there's going to be a child from you whose deeds are going to be as harsh as chometz, as harsh as vinegar. How so? Umanu, who is that? Menashe, the king Menashe, who was the son of Chizkiyahu, who was the wickedest king of Yehuda. He's also going to be your descendant. So there's the good and the bad, of course, because Ruth is the ancestor of David and the ancestress of David, and all the descendants, all the kings of Yehuda are descendants of David. So yeah, unfortunately, and she sat to the side of the harvesters, meaning not with them. That means she didn't sit among them, she sat beside them. Remez Ramazla, again, Boaz was hinting to her something about the future. That in the future, the kingdom of David is going to be split into two. As we know, in the times of the son of Shlomo, Rechavam, the kingdom is split between Rechavam and Yarovam, and remains split into Malchut Yisrael, Malchut Yehuda, until the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. So then it says, the next pasuk, it goes on to describe the food. Vaitzbod la kali, vatochal. And so it says that he gave her, he roasted her some grain and gave it to her to eat. So so this again is a hint for the future. That Amar Rabbi Elazar says vatochal bimei David, vatisba bimei Shlomo, vatotar bimei Chizkiah, because the end of the pasuk is that she ate, vatochal, vatisba, vatotar. She ate, she was satisfied, and she left over. So what do these three things mean? Again, a remez, a hint for the future. She's going to eat in the days of David, be satisfied in the days of Shlomo, and have leftovers in the days of Chizkiyahu, because that was another good time in Jewish history, the days of Chizkiyahu. Ikad Amrin, some say, Vatochal bimei David, she is going to eat in the days of David. Uvi mei Shlomo. So the word Vatochal is two times, David and Shlomo. What's Vatisba? What's being satisfied? Bimei Chizkiyah. That's in the times of Chizkiah, because of course in the times of Chizkiah they had another golden age during that time. Vatotar bimei Rabbi. And when is the distinction of the house of David going to return a third time? That's in the times of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, who was a descendant of David. In the times of Rabbi. Da'amar Mar, because the master said, Ahorire de Rabbi hava atir mishavur malka. They said that the stableman of Rabbi was richer than the king of Persia, Shavur Malka. In other words, even his lowly people were rich. Okay, he was so rich that his stable person, the person running his stable, was richer than a king. It's all relative, right? So, yeah. B'matnitatana we learned in a Tosefta, Vatochal ba'olam hazeh. What does Vatochal mean? In this world, Vatisba limot HaMashiach, and be satisfied in limot HaMashiach, Vatotar le'atid lavo, and in the future time, in Techiyat HaMetim, will have even more blessings. So the idea is that Ruth has a destiny of three blessings, and these blessings are, Ruth is symbolically really the kingdom of David. In this world there's a reward, in the next world there's a reward, and in the times of in this world there's a reward, in the times of Mashiach there's another reward for the house of David when it will be restored. And le'atid lavo, either that's referring to times of Techiyat HaMetim, or it's referring to Olam Haba, there will be even further reward. So there are three stages of reward ahead of us, and ahead of the house of David. And Be'ezrat Hashem will continue here with a little bit more agadot about the importance of dressing the parts, Talmidei Chachamim, and how they have to dress nicely and dress in a fashion which is respectable and dignified. Have a great day.